and dying in your beds many years from now, would you be willing to trade all the days from this day to that for one chance, just one chance, to come back here and tell our enemies that they may take our lives, but they'll never take our freedom?
And welcome to Anti-Tyranny News Radio here on UCY.tv. Thank you for joining me this evening. I'm going to dive into multiple topics. We'll get into some issues with law enforcement once again. Some other things to relate to that, dealing with a corrupt prosecutor and officer using false testimony, and a judge that stood up against the corruption and may have to deal with some consequences for doing so. So that'll be some interesting stuff to get into, and I will open up the phone lines later on in the broadcast so you all can put your voices in, your opinions or viewpoints. Now, I do kind of want to get into some stuff related to 2016 presidential campaign, and there was an article out of Politico that caught my eye, and it caught my eye because this is something that I've been talking about quite a bit. It has to do with Rand Paul and Ron Paul supporters. Now, I have mentioned that, I pointed out that Rand Paul is not Ron Paul. And many have argued that he's playing the game, that way he can get further along and do something that his father couldn't do. And I think, really, if you look at the reality of what Ron Paul was able to do and the pushback from the GOP, which I think that's what they're hinting to, is, well, he'll be able to play the, GOP and get them to like him. But like I've always said, it's going to backfire. A lot of, I would say about half of Ron Paul supporters, they don't even play the political game anymore. Many Ron Paul supporters have left that political, maybe not half, but that there's a large portion that just don't even play the political game no more. They've seen what happened to Ron Paul and his delegates at the last convention when we learned from, '08, and we're going to play their game. We will play it their way. and we'll show them what we can do. And you seen what happened at the national convention. Um, One group of Ron Paul supporters were led around in the bus around the convention center for hours to prevent them from going in. Other ones were voted basically or kicked out. Um, they wouldn't recognize them. And then when it came to voting time, they already had the teleprompter rigged with what result they were going to go with, no matter what the voice of the audience, the delegates, had to say. So a lot of Ron Paul supporters seen all this and said, even if we do, they'll make sure that they don't get elected. And lately, I've been seeing the false attacks on Rand Paul and how easily they're able to make them look bad, and you don't see a ton of outcry. When you seen them attack Ron Paul, it created a firestorm on the internet. People would post facts and everything to back up against the attack on Ron Paul. You don't see that with Rand Paul. You don't see that online movement with Rand Paul like you did Ron Paul. Well, I came across this Politico article here. It's titled 2016 Ron Paul supporters bolt Rand Paul camp. Many are disillusioned by Rand Paul's concessions to mainstream politics. It says here, as he pulls together his expected presidential campaign in Iowa and New Hampshire, Senator Rand Paul is confronted by defections from an unexpected quarter, the diehard idealist whose energy powered his father's campaigns. The network of committed supporters was expected to convey to Paul the natural successor to Ron Paul's libertarian movement, providing him with a plug-and-play ground organization in the make-or-break early voting states. But instead of embracing the Kentucky senator, many of those grassroots activists are turning their backs on him, disillusioned by the younger Paul's concessions to mainstream politics. Now, they mention some people in here. I don't believe these are the actual diehard Ron Paul grassroots people. I think these people are very much playing a political game because who they support, other than Ron Paul, doesn't really go with the ideology of libertarianism. But, in my opinion, on with the article, it says here, one of the most prominent defectors is Drew Ivers, chairman of Ron Paul's 2012 Iowa campaign, who says he will not endorse Rand Paul for president. On Tuesday, 3 members of Iowa's Ron Paul Aligned Liberty Movement, State Senator Jason Schultz and former Iowa Republican Party Central Committee members Chad Steenhoek and Joel Martinez announced the same, adding that they will support Texas Senator Ted Cruz. And we'll get into Ted Cruz here in a minute. Ivers says he does not plan to endorse any candidate. Senator Rand Paul continues to have tremendous support from the vast majority of the Liberty Movement, said Sergio Gore, communications director for the Paul campaign. Schultz had endorsed Ron Paul in 2012, and Gutierrez served as his Iowa regional director. Steinhoek worked for Newt Gingrich Iowa campaign. Now you might see what I'm talking about. but was sympathetic to Ron Paul, who endorsed Steinhook's subsequent bid to serve on the state central committee. Ivers, who had dinner with Rand Paul in August, said the Kentucky senator has abandoned many of the stances that made Ivers loyal to his father. He's moderating on most of them, not taking a real clear stance on a number of them, said Ivers. The strategy of sending a blended message is one that has risk. That was never an issue for Ron Paul, whose uncompromising ways and willingness to operate on the margins relegated him to the sidelines of national politics. Even the height of his national influence and popularity in 2012, the Texas congressman proved unable to win the popular vote in a single state and never seriously contended for the GOP nomination in several tries, which, again, go back to the 2012 GOP convention, and you'll see part of why that was, which, of course, Politico won't point out. I'm excited about the prospect of Senator Rand Paul running for president and look forward to his visit to Iowa on April 10th. If, as expected, he launches his presidential campaign, I will be proud to stand with Rand, who I believe stands head and shoulders above the other prospects in terms of electability and commitment to our cherished principles of freedom and prosperity, said David Fisher, a former Iowa GOP co-chairman who served as Iowa co-chair for Ron Paul's 2008 and 2012 campaigns. I've talked to hundreds of people who supported Ron Paul, and the vast majority of them are ready to stand with Rand. The stylistic distinctions between father and son became clear in the 2012 GOP convention. Ron Paul was denied a speaking slot in large part because he refused to meet the preconditions, which included an endorsement of Mitt Romney. But the Kentucky senator endorsed the nominee despite some misgivings and got a prime speaking slot. Not only that, he did not tell his father and mother that he was going to do this. He abruptly dropped out of his father's campaign and did this. And that just seemed kind of a little stab in the back, I think. At least, that's how it comes across. The defections in Iowa, where Ron Paul finished third in the 2012 caucuses, are notable since it was one of his best organized states that year. Rand Paul's challenge is to find balance that enables him to retain much of his father's strong political network in the make-or-break early states while broadening his appeal to a larger audience. An internal poll conducted last month by Liberty, Iowa, Ron Paul's delegates to the 2012 Iowa Republican Convention, the vanguard of his Hawkeye state loyalists, found that Rand Paul is still the preferred choice by a wide margin. But there are signs of erosion. Less than 70% are leaning Rand Paul's way in 2016, according to a person with knowledge of the polling who was not authorized to discuss it. Cruz was the group's second favorite candidate, with support in the high single digits, followed by Wisconsin Governor Scott Walker. For Curtinus, who initially planned on supporting Paul, the turning point came during Cruz's September 2013 filibuster of a continuing resolution to keep the federal government open. When Rand was filibustering, we saw Mike Lee and Ted Cruz standing there. When the shoe was on the other foot and Cruz was the one giving the filibuster, I and others in the Liberty movement looked around and asked, "Where's Rand?" said Curtinus. It kind of added insult to injury to learn that he planned to be at a fundraiser for Iowa Governor Terry Branstad that day. some of my text got cut off here. On the next paragraph, I guess. At the same time, Paul's Iowa effort is beset by lingering resentment from the state party establishment. Loyalists of Paul's father, led by A.J. Spiker, took control of the party's Central Committee in 2012 and alienated top office holders and grassroots activists from other wings of the party until they were pushed out last year. Spiker now works for Rand Pack. Obviously, the legacy from the Ron Paul people who ran the Republican Party of Iowa is not good statewide. They failed to raise money. They basically ran it as a background Ron Paul for president committee. They exclude a vast majority of Republican activists statewide and were genuinely not respected or liked, said Andy K-Boy, Republican activist from socially conservative Northwest Iowa. A seat of opposition to libertarian control of the party. A lot of us would like to judge Rand Paul on his own merits, but unfortunately, when he's hiring some of the same people that his father brought, it's a question of whether the apple has fallen far from the tree. In New Hampshire, with its more moderate brand of conservatism, Paul faces similar challenges. New Hampshire Rep. Bill O'Brien, a former state house speaker, said he's seen a number of Ron Paul supporters gravitating towards Cruz. Aaron Day, a leader of the Free State movement, which seeks to enact libertarian principles in New Hampshire, says members of the movement are showing markedly less enthusiasm for Rand Paul than they showed for his father. One of the big concerns is whether or not he's left his liberty base and is he moving towards the center in reality or just for the purpose of optics. And this is what I've talked about continuously. He said Day cited Paul's endorsement of moderate Republican Scott Brown's failed New Hampshire Senate bid and his lack of support for Tea Party activist Andrew Hemingway's gubernatorial primary bid against the eventual nominee Walt Havenstein as two episodes that turned off Free Staters. But several key members of Ron Paul's 2012 New Hampshire team plan either to join his son's campaign or support it from the sidelines. One of those supporters, former state Senator Jim Forsyth, the chairman of Ron Paul's New Hampshire campaign, dismissed the importance of disaffected Ron Paul backers. I think where you see that is some of the more fringe element libertarians. Of course, we've seen this fringe element. This hurt Ron Paul in 2012. These people that were part of Ron Paul's campaign that were going the fringe elements, these same people went to work for Rand Paul. Now, this ain't in the article. This is stuff that we know from the people that were working in and with and around the Ron Paul campaign and trying to support him. There was a section of these people that got into the Ron Paul campaign. One, which was his what was he? He was dating, he was his son-in-law, I believe. But there was a group of them, and they kept going the fringe element of Ron Paul's campaign. Kept calling the grassroots activists the fringe element. Now, the Tea Party flag waver Republicans, the ones that really didn't have a concise libertarian ideology or nothing like that. They just, we like freedom, and that's about it's the extent of their knowledge, which, you know, whatever. But anybody that really could have a intelligent argument, they kind of called fringe element libertarians, because they actually understood libertarian ideology. And I think Ron Paul was had by these people. And again, we see him part of Rand Paul's backing. And this is exactly why people like the Free Staters are not supporting him. Because he has the, you don't want those fringe element libertarians sitting there whispering in his ear the whole time. And then we see what Rand Paul's done, and he has basically left his libertarian roots, and he's kind of admitted that when he says, I'm not libertarian, I'm a libertarian Republican. But it says here, I think the people like me who run for office and understand the realities, I think those kind of people are going to be mainly on board. So the people that are used to the status quo game playing of politics and don't understand the shifting reality of society, the people that understand libertarian ideology, you don't want backing someone that claims to have any type of libertarian ideology. Yeah. But several key members around, or I already went through that. It says here, Forsyth said he got a glimpse of Paul's potential to transcend his father's small but hardcore base of support when he attended the 2012 Republican National Convention as a delegate. The traditional Republicans weren't clapping for Ron Paul. The Ron Paul supporters weren't getting up for McCain. But when Rand Paul got up, everyone was clapping, he said. Bob Goodman's senior advisor for the 2012 New Hampshire effort has assisted Rand Paul's recent trips to the state and expects to be involved with his primary campaign. State Representative Tammy Simmons' chair. Just like cut off whole portions here. She also plans to work on behalf of Rand Paul. Meanwhile, the hiring of Mike Biondo, a respected New Hampshire operative who served as Rick Santorum's national campaign manager as a strategist for Rand Paul's PAC, is expected to help Paul broaden his appeal in the state. He gets Rand Paul a hearing among a broader audience that simply people who were favorably inclined towards his father do, said former state GOP chairman Fergus Collin. Getting that out of Politico. Okay. Now, you hear a lot of talk about Ted Cruz. And if you don't remember, there was a clip where Ted Cruz was at a Liberty convention and basically he was calling for all this support for Israel. And I think that's the wrong move to make if you have actual libertarian ideology. I think individuals, not government, should choose when they should have to support something or not. But, if you send money to a group that government doesn't like, they call you a supporter of terrorism. If you send money towards a group they do like, then you're a friend of the administration. And I'm sure there might be people in the current administration that look at people sending money to Israel as terrorists. Of course, you sending money any extremist group over in the Middle East, you're definitely a terrorist. Especially in their eyes, I would look at you as a ignorant person supporting a group that is going to backfire in your face harder than you could ever expect. Personal view. So I think really supporting groups that you don't know the realities of what's going on is a ignorant and dumb choice anyways. But Ted Cruz basically shunned the audience for not supporting his remarks on supporting Israel. And I think that was definitely a turnoff for many people. There's one here out of We Are Change, why you should not vote for Ted Cruz in 2016. And this was pretty interesting. It's a small clip, so I'll go ahead and cue this up here.
Cruz has just announced his bid for the 2016 presidential election, and in this video we're going to tell you how this self-described outsider is really a flip-flopping, warmongering establishment neocon in hiding, and why you shouldn't vote for him in 2016. To start off his presidential announcement, it couldn't go any worse because he charged students with punishment and disciplinary actions and a $10 fine if they did not attend his presidential announcement. Now, those are the little details, but when it comes to foreign policy, Ted Cruz likes to describe himself somewhere between John McCain and Rand Paul. He even got the endorsement of Ron Paul in 2012 for the Senate. He described himself as a constitutionalist, as a conservative. He's banking on libertarian and Tea Party support, and his lingo and his language is pretty good on face value. But if you look at the 3 years that he was in the Senate, he's a pure neocon warhawk. He tried to actually pass a resolution that would give Barack Obama the power to strip Americans accused of terrorism to get stripped of their citizenship without due process of law. Mr. Ted Cruz wanted Barack Obama to have the power to accuse anyone of terrorism and then deny their citizenship without due process. Now, who does the U.S. government consider potential terrorists? If you look at some of the military documents that have been leaked, some of them that have been made public, you are a supposed domestic terrorist if you use social media or you question mainstream ideologies. If you're a patriot, if you're anti-immigrant, anti-Muslim, if you're a part of the patriot movement, pretty much all of Ted Cruz's base would have been deported if this resolution that he proposed would have been passed. Ted Cruz also, when it comes to the people he backs, he isolates a lot of people when he knowingly wants people like the neocon Joe Lieberman for defense secretary. His plan on defeating ISIS is simply just bombing ISIS and bombing Iran at the same time. This is Ted Cruz's plan. Just bomb the crap out of them. Forget about entanglements. We're just going to bomb the crap out of them. I guess Ted Cruz forgot that Iran is actually fighting ISIS and finding U.S. military weapons and heavy artillery when they do make headway against this terrorist organization. But Ted Cruz says, no, we're just going to bomb ISIS. We're going to bomb Iran if we have to. His policies are 100% hawkish. His resolutions that he tried to get passed are totally violating the rule of law and the Constitution in many ways, shape, or form. And then you look at his wife, Heidi Cruz, who, of course, he's going to rally against crony capitalism, but his wife is the vice president of the Houston, Texas Goldman Sachs chapter. She was the economic advisor to Bush in 2011, and as we could see by Bush's economic policies, they sucked and were horrible. She's described as an expert in NAFTA, which is the #1 destructive government action against the American worker in American history. And if that doesn't beat it, she's also a member of the Council on Foreign Relations, the most prominent influential group when it comes to American foreign policy. This shadowy secret group was described as a pernicious nest of snakes that is working to undermine our sovereignty. And who said this? Ted Cruz. Ted Cruz said this about the Council on Foreign Relations, which Heidi Cruz is a part of. Heidi Cruz is a part of the establishment working for Goldman Sachs, working for the old Bush administration, working for the Council on Foreign Relations. Something that Ted Cruz, described in other speeches as a pit of vipers. So there's so many contradictions here. We have Ted Cruz portraying himself as this great freedom, constitution change member that's going to radically change the way we live, that we should vote for him in 2016, when in reality, he is the same old power-broking corporate government elite establishment candidate like everyone else. And that's why you shouldn't vote for Ted Cruz in any way, shape, or form. Every 8 years, they dangle somebody that's completely different from a different political party that promises all these changes. But just like Barack Obama after George W. Bush, we saw the same corporate, war hawkish, military-industrial complex policies continue no matter what, with bankers being able to get away and do everything and anything that they wanted. It's all a globalist game, and Ted Cruz is a part of it. So don't be fooled. Vote nobody 2016. Make that a hashtag. Hashtag vote nobody 2016. Thank you again so much for watching. If you found this video helpful about Ted Cruz as a presidential candidate, click the like button and don't forget to subscribe. We're going to go through all the presidential candidates as they list their announcement for the 2016 presidential candidates so you can get a full spectrum view of how corrupt this whole system is.
Okay. So you have Ted Cruz's wife connected with NAFTA, the CFR, and Goldman Sachs, while you have Ted Cruz out here talking against NAFTA, CFR, Goldman Sachs type rhetoric. This is what you have Glenn Beck at points championing, but at the same time he has some mural put on his wall, Rand Paul 2016 graffiti type stuff. But he keeps championing people like Ted Cruz. Why does he champion Ted Cruz so much? I believe that a lot of it has to do with Glenn Beck's support for Israel and Ted Cruz's support for Israel. And I think I've seen Rand Paul try to play that game. But you also had Ted Cruz, why he's been, in Congress, support a bill that would give Obama the power to strip you of your citizenship for simply being suspected of terrorism. Well, there was a speech given by none other than Rand Paul. And let me cue it up here. And he pointed out some things that could make you, put you on that suspect list that Ted Cruz voted for, or, supported, or voted, whatever, for a bill that would give Obama the power to strip your citizenship for being put on this list. So what are these things? Right? Let's hear them again from Rand Paul.
Know good and well that someday there could be a government in power that is shipping its citizens off for disagreements. There are are laws on the books now that characterize who might be a terrorist. Someone missing fingers on their hands is a suspect, according to the Department of Justice. Someone who has guns, someone who has ammunition that is weatherproofed, someone who has more than 7 days of food in their house can be considered a potential terrorist. If you are suspected by these activities, do you want to have the government have the ability to send you to Guantanamo Bay for indefinite detention? A suspect. We're not talking about someone who has been tried and found guilty. We're talking about someone suspected of activities. But some of the things that make you suspicious of terrorism are having food, having more than 7 days of food, missing fingers on your hand, having ammunition, having weatherproofed ammunition, having several guns at your house. Is that enough? Are you willing to sacrifice your freedom for liberty? I would argue that we should strike these detainee provisions from this bill because we are giving up our liberty. We are giving up the constitutional right to have due process before we're sent to a prison. This is very important. I think this is a constitutional liberty we should not look at and blithely sign away to the executive power or to the military. So I would call for support of the amendment that will strike the provisions on keeping detainees indefinitely, particularly the fact that we could now, for the first time, send American citizens to prisons abroad. I think that is a grave danger to our constitutional liberty, and I advise a vote to strike these provisions from the bill. Thank you, Mr. President.
So that had to deal with the NDAA. Now, what makes Cruz worse is he was supporting something that would make that not even an issue. Because even if you got rid of that provision, what Ted Cruz was supporting is the ability for the president to strip you of your citizenship without due process. Therefore, you would never have to have due process if they took you as a suspected terrorist. So even if the provision striked from the NDA that allowed them to obtain American citizens, this would just go, well, we can get around that by going, well, you're no longer a U.S. citizen, therefore we can still kidnap you and not give you due process, while not giving you due process to strip you of your citizenship. And of course, you know, you look at a libertarian ideology, you know, government doesn't give citizenship, you give yourself citizenship no matter where you're at. If you live somewhere, you live there. That's where you reside. And, you know, citizenship is a government thing. But if you're going to look at it more of a constitutionalist, well, they're just shredding that all to hell too. So, if there's any Ron Paul, Ron Paul supporters that support Ron Paul 2008, 2012, that want to chime in on Rand Paul, Ted Cruz, and all of them, feel free to call in. Phone lines are open 718-717-8296, 718-717-8296. Feel free to call in. I just want to know where, what's going on in the minds of most Ron Paul supporters. You know, I've seen what the more mainstream people that support Ron Paul have said. I kind of know where a lot of the free staters up in New Hampshire are. But what about throughout the country? So if you were a Ron Paul supporter, do you support Rand Paul? Do you support Ted Cruz? Do you support any of them? Or are you kind of more on the path that many have chosen and say, I don't support anybody. It's just, no matter, even if you got Rand Paul, it's a no-win situation. And I've heard that. Okay. Now, something else I've been talking about is this divide and conquer among the libertarians, the liberty people, the freedom people. We seen it happen to the Tea Party when, the modern day Tea Party was first brewing up. It was pun there. When you look at when the original '08 campaign for Ron Paul started brewing at the grassroots, that was your creation of the modern day Tea Party. And there was one, I forget his name, but on Fox News, and he was about the only one that kept pointing out, Ron Paul's the father of the Tea Party. This is where the original concept of the modern day Tea Party was started, and I remember that. And, those seemed like hopeful days at the time. You've seen a lot of people that believed in freedom from the left, the right, the middle, everywhere, they go, we know where this guy is going to stand on things. He does not compromise in his ideology. He really stays on target. You don't have to wonder where he's going to be on something. You don't really have that with Rand Paul, and you don't have that enthusiasm like you did with Ron Paul. And when you had grassroots that came together and broke, records in history for online campaigning, with the creation of the money bombs, that the Ron Paul campaign, they did not come up with this. This was grassroots supporters. And then, you've seen supporters paying for blimps to fly around that say Google Ron Paul or Ron Paul Revolution. And the momentum behind it. It was something that the establishment definitely step back for a second and go, whoa, we're kind of in some trouble here. We need to get a hold on this. You've seen where Fox News, people that were within the GOP and all these people really throwing all the censorship and roadblocks up and, stopping Ron Paul from having too much of an influence on what we now call the sheeple. And you just remember those days and you go, why don't we have those days anymore? Well, because the people that have learned from Ron Paul have learned what he talked about. They haven't truly learned from Ron Paul because they don't live it the way that he did. Because you have Ted Cruz. Do you really think that with his wife there, that he's really going to stand up against her friends? I don't see that happening. Rand Paul has compromised too much to garner a vote or even be successful going back to maybe his roots. I think that we have such a corrupt system, and I think the saying that absolute power corrupts absolutely, and I think that's what the federal level politics really is. That's why it doesn't. I already knew what a lot of the free staters their stances and their focus. I think is one of the better focuses of any type of libertarian group. Now, I don't agree with all free staters. It's a diverse group, but focusing at the local level, I think, is one of the biggest things. And that's what they've really been doing lately is focusing at the local level. Now, if someone like Ron Paul was running, I think you would see the free staters come out in numbers. Of course, with all the election laws, I'm sure they would be trying to catch him doing something wrong. Demonize them. Because a lot of them also hold public office now, so they've made pretty good strides up there. But since all this went on, since, the failure of getting Ron Paul elected and a lot of disappointment with any so-called liberty candidates anymore, we've seen a lot of divide and conquer. It started at that original Tea Party level. It's moved along, and we just continue to see it. And then I've seen this out of the Libertarian Standard, libertarianstandard.com, against the Libertarian Cold War. And I think this kind of will feed into the foreign aspect of everything with the U.S. and Russia and Ukraine. But this also touches on a much broader thing among libertarian, liberty, freedom activists, outspoken people, or just thinkers. It's created a whole new divide and conquer. Let me read this article here. It says, a controversy has risen in the libertarian movement over the proper approach to events concerning Russia, Ukraine, and Crimea. Like many such controversies, it has quickly polarized almost everyone and has served as a proxy for long-standing factionalism within the movement. People quickly accused each other of supporting Putin's aggression or backing violent U.S. intervention. I myself have been accused of both kissing up to the Russian regime and dishing out State Department propaganda. And I have to intervene here because, I've had people go, well, you support Russia? No. You support no. Do you support Ukraine? I support the individuals in Ukraine that don't want a part of any of this crap. Playing sides, my personal opinion. You're just playing what foot is going to kick the everyday person in the butt. And I don't think we should be picking which foot should be kicking who. That's not what libertarian ideology is about. But when you talk about the things going on, well, if Russia's making an aggression, then you're going to talk against that aggression. And then when the U.S. is making aggression, you're going to talk against that. And if you ever talk out against one, you're immediately accused of supporting the other. That's not how it is. But this has been more and more becoming a dividing issue. And we can't let the divide and conquer happen. But back to the article, it says here, This doesn't itself show I have the right balance in my position, only that this feud has galvanized libertarians and hardened their radical um, loyalties. We might learn something from looking back at the 20th century during the Cold War. Most Western critics of state power eared too far in one direction or the other. There were some whose opposition to U.S. wars led them to soften their assessment of communist aggression. Free market and leftist lovers of peace both made this mistake. At the same time, many who favored economic and political liberty often let their anti-communism translate into support for American militarism and the security state. This confusion pervaded Americans across the spectrum. We can all see this now, yes. Some anti-war Americans were obscenely soft on the communists. Well-meaning but foolish Westerners said nice things about Lenin, Stalin, and Mao, and many of a more moderate tinge had no perspective of how much worse international communism was than the U.S. system, at least as it concerned domestic affairs. Meanwhile, many libertarians and almost all conservatives ditched their supposed attachment to skepticism of government power and signed on to the U.S. Cold War effort. This American project included dozens of coups and interventions, the instruction of foreign secret police in unspeakable torture techniques, murderous carpet bombings, and killed hundreds of thousands of peasants, and wars that indirectly brought about the Khmer Rouge and the rise of Islamist fundamentalism, both of which also became directly funded in the same of anti-communism. In the name, jeez, I can't speak today. It is easy to look back and see how Westerners were wrong on both the Cold War and communist states, each of which killed millions of people and nearly brought the world to the brink of nuclear holocaust. The stakes were so much higher than in anything going on with Russia now. Imprecision in one's moral assessment, either in defense of Nixon or Tito, was far more condemnable than criticizing Putin or Obama too harshly. The errors of almost all the great 20th century libertarians, free marketeers, and peaceniks far exceeded any errors some might have today in their appraisal of NATO or Russia and Ukraine, and yet we forgive many people on both sides of the Cold War division. No one today actually thinks Hayek was a neocon or Rothbard a pinko. Today's polarization is all the more frustrating given the bulk of American libertarians seem to agree on two major points. The U.S. should not intervene in Eastern Europe, and two, Putin's various power grabs are indefensible. Thus, most libertarians are not truly as divided as well-meaning Americans were in the Cold War. Now, one's emphasis is important. Not all acts of aggression are equal, but before addressing that, it's useful to try to actually understand the splits in the movement right now. I usually identify four factions, not two. A. There are people who outright defend Putin's aggression in Ukraine and Crimea and who otherwise downplay his autocratic tendencies. B. There are those who agree that Putin is worth condemning but who think it's more important to emphasize the evils of U.S. intervention. C. There are those who agree U.S. intervention is unwise and maybe even unethical, but who think it's important right now to emphasize Putin's disposition. I can't even speak today, jeez. D. There are those who outright favor U.S. and Western intervention to stop Putin. Now, I don't fall in any of those because I believe that the people of all these countries need to stand up against their government and tell their government to back down, including the U.S. Stop. Just stop. The polarization of discussion has led to A and B teaming up against C and D, and has also led to people in the B camp pretending like no one on their side is actually defending Putin, while people in the C camp are pretending no one on their side is actually calling for war of major U.S. interventions. A principal opponent of state power is tempted to say that, in fact, B and C are on one side despite differences in emphasis, and A and D are two extremes flirting with nationalism, statism. This is my position, although I say that I have friends, good friends, who flirt with being in Camp A as well as in Camp D. It happens, and to make the point again, during the Cold War, any libertarian activists who have probably had some friends who advocate nuclear strikes against the SSR and others who support Soviet control of the Eastern Bloc, both of these positions would have been completely immoral and disgusting, far worse than anything said by anyone in Camp A or Camp D today. Yet today's Cold War replay is leading people to defriend each other in the name of Minich's struggle. The tendency of people to break ties with others over this will only increase the polarization and erode mutual understanding. On the other hand, Camps A and D are at least being outright in their positions, while B and C are letting themselves get dragged into a flame war against each other when they both agree on both Putin's and American actions. Both B and C are being disingenuous about some of their allies in the attempt to seem reasonable and principled and say the other side is the only one that's unbalanced. In both cases, the problem appears to be nationalism. Exactly. A desire to defend Putin's actions as consistent with Russia rather than individualist concerns, or a desire to see American intervention as being more defensible than Russia's aggression because, well, at least it's American and we have better, more liberal values at home. Both tendencies are, in fact, very illiberal, as are the attempts to collectively attack people on the other side of the debate, when, for all of you know, some of them agree with you on all the fundamentals more than some people on your side do. The arguments over Russia has brought the Cold War back to the movement. They have fractured those primarily committed to anti-interventionism and those primarily concerned with liberty for all worldwide, when in fact these values are two sides of the same coin. The primary libertarian reason to oppose U.S. wars, of course, is that they kill foreigners and they divide people into tribes based on nationality, that they are acts of nationalist aggression. Curiously, refighting the Cold War within libertarianism, it will only harden people's hearts, polarize their loyalties, and ultimately compromise their principles and clarity of thought. I plead young libertarians who refuse to be a proxy belligerent in this Cold War, when the most part is probably not really about Russia or Crimea at all. It's about major factions within the movement with more fundamental disagreements, using this as an opportunity to fight. If you actually seek to understand everyone's positions, you'll be surprised how heterogeneous attitudes are, despite the attempt to turn this current affairs disagreement into a grander sectarian dispute. So what should we think? We should probably take a middle ground between B and C, like I've said. Putin isn't just aggressor, he's one of the worst on the planet. He killed tens of thousands of Chechens. He oversees one of the most vast prison populations on Earth. I wouldn't say that. He is essentially a late communist holdover of the party variety in everything but name. and his violations of civil liberties, free speech, and dignity of homosexuals and others are not minor matters for any libertarian who cares about the rights of all people on earth. His invasion of Ukraine was unjustified. His annexation of Crimea cannot be defended, and although some critics have exaggerated the evils of his tutorial power grabs by comparing them to Stalin or Hitler's expansionism, it is true that Putin's defenders' arguments based on ethnic nationalism should indeed be used to justify the most infamous European land grabs that occurred that same decade. As for the United States, its foreign policy is a lot worse than Putin's biggest detractors wish to acknowledge. While Putin has killed more people than Obama, he does not appear to have killed more people as Bush, and yes, it is a moral failure and deviation from libertarianism to downplay the Iraq War as anything less than one of the very most intentional atrocities of our new century, and one of the dramatically taints the moral character of U.S. Diplomacy. What the last few U.S. administrations have done will haunt much of the world for decades. The aggression has hardly ceased. Obama's drone killings are one of the most infamous human rights violations on the planet. The drug war imposed on Mexico has taken tens of thousands of lives. Americans' own civil liberties record is far worse than some on Team America wish to confront. There are tens of millions of people much worse off throughout the world because of recent U.S. diplomacy and wars, and only a cold utilitarian would even attempt to justify this record. I understand why some libertarians are inclined to emphasize one point or the other. Those Americans focusing on U.S. criminality are right that we have more influence, a bit marginally so, on the government that lords over us. That if we don't stand up for the U.S. war machine and its covert ops, no one will, and stand up to, not for. And the criticism of foreign aggression often fuels war propaganda at home, but others are frustrated that just because the U.S. government condemns Russian aggression, they're supposed to keep quiet. My country is the world, as Tom Paine said. And libertarians around the world should condemn aggression anywhere it happens. Pretending the U.S. government is the world's only major problem is naive at best. The first group is often right that liberal states are more belligerent in foreign affairs, and the second group is often right that it's easy for people here to forget about victims of foreign oppression. Such dynamics played themselves out in the Cold War too, and both sides had a point. It would have been demoralizing to be berated for attacking either U.S. or Soviet aggression in those times. And the article goes on for another few paragraphs. Check it out at libertarianstandard.com. And you know, this kind of goes to looking at a lot of the different things that the liberty movement is being divided on. And it's like, you know, you have some liberty people going, I'm going to keep trying at the federal level. You have other libertarians going, no, screw that dude at the local level. Which I'm going to screw that dude at the local level. Problem is when you start going, that guy's an idiot because he's trying to fight politics at the federal level. He should do it at the local level. And our guy going, you'll never be able to succeed at the local level unless you get someone at the federal level that'll allow it to happen. There's arguments on both sides, and I think each person plays their part. And I think that's the most important thing. You know, I've always said diversity is beautiful when it comes to, you know, the human race, different cultures, all that. But diversity is beautiful when you are an activist or a person trying to change the system. Don't condemn the other person for, you know, having the same views as you and attacking it at a different level or different position, because that completely diverts the attention away from the real issues that you both agree on. Just because one person might want to try to do it at the federal level or do it within the Republican Party, not the Libertarian Party. Some people want to support the Libertarian. The more that the idea of liberty grows, the more influence we'll have at all those levels. And you can't get those people on board if you're constantly fighting each other and making both sides look bad in the eyes of newcomers that look at it and go, if that's what it's about, they're not seeing the good coming from both sides. They're seeing you both trash talking each other and seeing the bads of both sides. That's what they're getting their focus on, and they go, well, I don't want to be a part of the liberty movement because, well, I don't agree with either side. They're both, doing bad things. And it's such a shame because there's going to be flaws in all of us. We're the human race is flawed. That's what we are. So to act like that, oh, we're going to find those perfect group of people, I think it's idiotic. Okay, I'm going to kind of move on since we're kind of talking about foreign affairs right now. One thing I want to play from Alternative Media TV, AM TV, kind of goes into something that I've talked about in the past. And it's about the caliphate and what's kind of going on, something that has only been helped along by U.S. intervention and U.S. support at the same time. I've mentioned my theory about, allowing Saudi Arabia to basically become the new Ottoman Empire, and them being another proxy to help take out the rest of the regimes in the Middle East to make it one. You have the EU, you have Russia, China. They want to, again, make the American Union, which you have Ted Cruz linked to the North American Union, which I'll get back into that here in a minute. But one thing I want to focus on this foreign thing real quick is I've said this, that I think that we're kind of helping that along. I think ISIS is a tool that's used, but I think it's kind of one of those kind of out of control tools that you use it and then you have to try to control it and destroy the factions that you can't control. And I think Saudi Arabia will get to that at some point, which there's a lot of stuff that ISIS does that I think Saudi Arabia would agree cold-heartedly with, because they do beheadings and stonings and all that crap. And but I've said that, they need ISIS to take care of things for them, which we know ISIS has been fighting Syria, which we go, oh, we're going to support Syrian rebels that aren't with the regime, but they're against ISIS. And you find out, well, all these weapons end up in ISIS hands, so apparently they're not against ISIS. Not to mention all the stuff we left behind. But I've said, that they're going to use ISIS as their tool to take down these other regimes. That way they can create their caliphate, their Ottoman Empire, with Saudi Arabia being the power structure behind it. Well, ISIS, Iran's been having to deal with ISIS. And Iran is pretty kind of a little bit afraid of ISIS. Well, I got something here from AMTV. Well, Saudi Arabia just launched some stuff against Yemen, targeting Yemen. Well, this from AMTV, Christopher Green, is reporting that Yemen crisis final target is Iran. Well, you already have Iran dealing with ISIS. Now, what happens when Saudi Arabia goes after Iran? Let me cue this up here.
Hey everybody, I'm Christopher Green. You're tuning into AMTV Alternative Media Television. It is, I believe, Thursday, March 26, 2015. This is going to be a low-budget production this morning. We're on the road today, so we're not going to have access to fancy internet. Can't do all those cool effects and all that stuff that you're used to. But I still wanted to deliver some critical news. In fact, I've got my cell phone. I'm using an iPhone on airplane mode right now, which brings me into the first story of the day. The Germanwings flight, according to investigators, that crashed, that was coming from, I believe, Barcelona, Spain to Dusseldorf, Germany. It turns out, according to investigators, and we already suspected this because there was an 8-minute controlled descent for 8 minutes without a mayday, without a warning, without any kind of message being sent to the ground. It turns out it was voluntary manslaughter. Although they're not calling it terrorism, even though I would say that that is an act of terror if you commit suicide, voluntary manslaughter, lock the pilot out from getting into the cockpit, engage in a controlled descent for 8 minutes, and then kill roughly 150 people. It's not just voluntary manslaughter, it's murder. They're saying it's not linked to terrorism, although I'm sure Obama will probably speak at some point this afternoon and link it to whatever convenient boogeyman is convenient for the mainstream media and our politicians in Washington, D.C., currently fighting these wars in the Middle East. But I'll get to that in a moment. The first question that came to mind is, how is it possible that a pilot could be locked out of his own cockpit? Aren't there other safeguards in place? Couldn't they enter a code and a keypad or something and get back in? The answer to that question is yes, but they only have a certain amount of minutes to do it. And at least from the reports that have been released so far, don't know if this particular plane was equipped with that technology. I mean, what if the co-pilot had a heart attack? He died, and the other pilot couldn't get back in. I mean, there should be some kind of safeguard to get back into the plane. You would think with today's technology that in addition to that, with maybe a backup key or some kind of keypad or some kind of logistical strategy behind that, that we would even be able to unlock the cockpit door from the ground. I mean, isn't this the surveillance state? Couldn't the FAA or one of these groups unlock the door in an emergency? Because, for a minute, put yourself in the horror-filled circumstances of the 150 passengers or so on board who knew that the pilot was locked out of the plane, the cries, the screams, the terror. I mean, this is an act of terrorism. I don't care what they tell you. The knocking on the door, the pounding on the door, trying to break it down as they plunged to their imminent death. Again, what were the motives of this co-pilot? A 28-year-old individual I tried to look up. I couldn't get any information on. I was looking for a picture. If you found one, put it in that comment box below. I'm sure our other subscribers would be interested. Again, we don't know the motive at this point, but we know it was, they're not calling it an act of terror, but it is an act of terror, and it is a heinous act. The souls and lives that were lost, rest in peace. Leads us to our next story in Yemen. There is a crisis in Yemen right now, and I think it's being overlooked by everyone. I think it's being overlooked by the mainstream media. I would argue, in my professional opinion, it's being misrepresented and misreported. Again, they're always blurring the truth. Yemen is in crisis. There has been a revolt. The Shiite radicals, as the mainstream media on the ground likes to call them, have overthrown the existing government. But what the mainstream media doesn't tell you is the U.S. actually overthrew the government not too long ago as a result of the instituted Arab Spring protests which were launched covertly by our intelligence agencies here in the West and our allies of the countries like Saudi Arabia and Israel, had recently installed puppet dictators friendly to the West, kind of like we do in Ukraine all the time, and we do in all these other countries in the Middle East. It's those guys that have been thrown out. We just had a revolution there, spawned by the United States illegally, as is the case time and time again. And now there's been another revolution, a re-revolution, by the Shiites that just happened to be backed by Iran. Isn't that interesting? I thought that the President of the United States, Barack Hussein Obama, was in the process of negotiating some kind of nuclear agreement with Iran, a peace deal. I thought that they were our friends, that he was going to give them a timeline of 10 years before they could develop a nuke bomb and potentially destroy the world. So what's interesting is that the Shiites on the ground are overthrowing the wrongful leaders that the United States had installed not too long ago, courtesy of the Arab Spring protests and that movement. They call it the Arab Spring, but it was really just an act of terrorism propagated by the United States federal government and their allies, countries like Israel and Saudi Arabia. Now, what's interesting about this is occurring in the Arabian Peninsula, where there is vast oil reserves, and it also borders Saudi Arabia. So the new Saudi king, there's been some changes there, has moved armaments to his border. He did this just a few days ago. And late last night, as I was running through my cell phone, they started bombing the shit out of Yemen. You see, what the pundits were calling could be a civil war in Yemen, it's turned out could likely be a much more deadly, violent regional conflict, a regional war, kind of like General Wesley Clark told us about post 9/11, when he was flabbergasted having received an internal memo allegedly from Donald Rumsfeld at the time, who I believe was Secretary of Defense under George W. Bush, that the United States was going to attack country after country in the Middle East, whether or not it was Iraq or Afghanistan or Syria or Libya, with the murder of Muammar Gaddafi, or eventually Iran being the end goal. So isn't it interesting? It's the Shiites backed by Iran on the ground that are fighting the Sunnis that make up Al-Qaeda, AQAP, Al-Qaeda Arabian Peninsula, and ISIS, ISIL, as Obama likes to call them. You see how the lines blur here? In actuality, the United States is on the same team as ISIS right now. Obama's on the same team as ISIL because they're fighting the Shiites on the ground. This is why Saudi Arabia just stepped up these efforts and is bombing the shit out of Yemen, and it's threatening to spiral out of control. It's also put a bit on oil prices. Isn't that interesting? I've talked a lot about oil, how it's been artificially manipulated lower to put pressure on Russia, the enemies of the United States and her allies, other countries like Iran. And now there's a bid on Wall Street. It's another reason I was very bullish oil, because of this geopolitical risk. You know, you've got douchebags on CNBC like Dennis Gartman saying that oil was going to go to $15 just a couple of weeks ago, and then flip-flopped and said oil is consolidating. Well, it's now up some 2% when I checked my iPhone earlier this morning. It's trading at, I believe, that $40, $50 range, whether or not you're looking at Brent or WTI. All of this is boiling out of control in the Middle East, folks. It's not just Iraq. It's not just Afghanistan. It's not just Syria, the ongoing destabilization effort and attempted overthrow, courtesy of the United States, of the Bashar al-Assad government, the staged chemical attacks that made up Ghouta that were total bullshit, that was proven by the United Nations and people like Carla Del Ponte weeks and months later. It's Yemen. It's soon to be Iran. You see, Iran is the final target. That's why I want to believe for a minute these negotiations. I think it's a smokescreen, actually, that the United States can say, hey, we tried to negotiate, but the deal fell through. And that's why we're going to war. We provided them and presented them a perfect deal regarding their nuclear program, but they just wouldn't bite. They just wouldn't accept. And now we are at war. We will go to war with Iran. You see, Obama and Bibi, King Bibi, Benjamin Netanyahu, although they hate each other personally, I mean, there is a vile hate for each other. These men hate each other. I'd like to see them in a boxing match. They're actually on the same team because they both fully intend to go to war with Iran. It's one of the reasons the destabilization effort has been propagated by the West in the Levant, what is formerly known as Iraq and Syria. It's why the entire Middle East is blowing up. It's why there's this war ever since post the Arab Spring, arguably for the past several decades. It's why this destabilization effort has been created. It's why groups like Al-Qaeda have been created by intelligence agencies here in the United States. It's why ISIS, ISIL, the new boogeyman, is no different. You see, the United States is actually on the same team as ISIS and ISIL, on the same team of Obama, fighting the Shiites on the ground in Yemen. It's boiling over, folks. You know, pretty crazy, unbelievable stories. This is happening in real time. You know, you can take a look at it from a biblical perspective. Those of you that have biblical reference, you know that Iran's the final target. You can look at it from a political perspective. You know Iran is the final target. We are going to war with Iran. That's what's coming next. I'm Christopher Green. I'll keep you posted. Hard hitting it in your face. Click the link below to support our.
Okay, I'm going to add on to that. Now, we've supposedly been trying to help stop ISIS. You know, definitely in Syria, we don't want ISIS to control Syria. Except they continue to gain ground and are basically just fighting the Syrian government, which seems to have, no backing from the U.S. to stop ISIS. We'll support the people that are fighting ISIS and the Syrian military. That would be a stupid war to be involved in. How can you support a group that's trying to fight two fronts? Well, because they couldn't possibly be fighting the Syrian government and ISIS with the number ISIS has and the military power that Syria has that they can expend. I don't think there would be any rebel group that would take that challenge on. Therefore, if they are fighting the Syrian government, it's more than likely they're fighting with the rebels. But okay, McCain, no, that is not correct. If you believe anything that kook says. And then Iran, you know, I don't see anything good coming out of this. I think that our government is helping establish their world government. And Saudi Arabia, even though we believe in human rights and can't justify stoning women and all that, but we partner with Saudi Arabia that does all of that to fight the guys in the cave that do that end up with all of our gear. That just happened to be destabilizing the Middle East, giving Saudi Arabia the chance to be the new Ottoman Empire. And then you start seeing how, everything seems to be centralizing. And I kind of go back again to the warning about Ted Cruz. You know, there's the whole Ted Cruz his wife and the North American Union. Give me a second here while I try to pull something up. But we have the whole Ted Cruz thing where you have Ted Cruz out here championing for some things, and then you look at it and, you find out that his wife is connected to NAFTA. Okay, I got one here from Next News Network, and it's talking about Ted Cruz, first president of the North American Union. And it goes into this. And his wife basically supports all of those groups that are working towards this centralization of areas around the world. Therefore, more central control, more world government. And like we say about many things, it doesn't happen overnight. It's always a progression. And we know what the end game is because they keep telling us, and they keep telling us the steps that they need to take and refining how they're doing these things. Well, we used to try working the system, and well, the people got wise to that, and they're working the system, so let's just go over the system and just screw the system. Like we go screw the Constitution, that is a very founding document that even gives our government existence. So then you go, well, if they say that that's void, are they not null and void too? But let's get into this. Next news.
Well, Monday marked the start of the Next News Network's Selection 2016 coverage as Senator Ted Cruz made it official with these colorful words captured by ABC News while speaking at Liberty University.
I believe in you. I believe in the power of millions of courageous conservatives rising up to reignite the promise of America. And that is why today I am announcing that I'm running for President of the United States.
Now, Ted Cruz says he believes in you. That's why he's running. But should we believe in him? Just who is Ted Cruz? Well, after my quick hit news report on Monday, the YouTube comments erupted. Rogue Spirit 1966 commented, "Welcome to the political pageant show where puppet after puppet is preparing to fill every ear with their brand of lies and fear." The Daily Baker said Ted Cruz is a robot zombie shill. And Dmitry Vinchov said a Canadian-born person is running for prez. The Constitution is garbage now. Then Happy Hooly Days said he had some colorized comments stating, "Fuck politicians and all you dumb sheeple who support them. Brain dead scum." And between laughs, Chontin said, "Ha ha, ha ha. LMAO, 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 LMAO. That idiot? LMAO, LMAO, LMAO." However, Preps etc. posted my favorite comment with this revelation. "Oh, please, you should all be aware that Ted Cruz's wife, Heidi, is a vice president for Goldman Sachs. Would they be more disturbed to know about her work on the independent task force that wrote Building a North American Community, which was sponsored by the Council on Foreign Relations?" Well, that is certainly a revelation in itself. Well, perhaps you just open up a can of worms. Now, before you get your tea bags in a bunch about this Ted Cruz pile-on, let's take a step back and understand what Preps is saying. And if you love America as much as you say, then you'll listen very closely. So Ted Cruz stands up and says it's time to step up and restore the American promise. But what promise is he speaking of? The promise his wife broke when she sold America out to the Council on Foreign Relations? The promise that she broke when she began work on building a North American community? What the heck is that, you ask? Well, yes, it does sound so innocent. We're just building a community for North America. Surely you can't be against building a community, right? Well, yes, Mrs. Ted Cruz, I am. So how do you dissolve a nation's sovereignty peacefully And with the people's consent, well, you can just ask Mrs. Cruz or anyone living in Europe for that matter. They all now use one currency. You see, the transformation of Europe into a single national body with its own bank, legislative body, and military force took many, many years to accomplish, about 42 to be exact. It began with the Treaty of Paris in 1951, and that created the European Coal and Steel Community. And then when the 1957 Treaty of Rome was signed, it morphed into the European Economic Community. In 1993, by order of the Maastricht Treaty, it was renamed the European Community and then absorbed by the newly formed European Union. So why is this important to Americans? Why should you care? Well, one only needs to work the clock backwards from Heidi Cruz's work to build a North American community to see what the globalists have in store for this hemisphere. What follows is only a portion of the exhaustive timeline that's posted at globalresearch.ca.
Now, I'm the first to acknowledge that there's a good deal left unfinished on the conservative agenda. Our cleanup crew will need more than 2 years to deal with the mess left by others for over half a century.
Now, it all began with Ronald Reagan, Republican, in 1979. He was campaigning, and while he was campaigning, he proposed the North American Agreement to produce, quote, a North American continent in which the goods and people of the three countries will cross boundaries more freely. He fulfilled that campaign promise in 1981 when he presented the idea of a North American common market. Then 4 years later, in 1985, he notified Congress of his desire to begin negotiations with Canada on a free trade agreement to promote trade. He gives then Congress 90 days to approve it. 2 years later, in October of 1987, the Canada-United States Free Trade Agreement is finalized. U.S. Trade Representative Clayton Uter said of the agreement, quote, we've signed a stunning new trade pact with Canada. The Canadians don't understand what they've signed. In 20 years, they will be sucked into the U.S. economy. With Reagan sealing up Canada in 1990, the new president, George H.W. Bush, would begin work on Mexico.
It is a big idea, a new world order, where diverse nations are drawn together in common cause to achieve the universal aspirations of mankind, peace and security, freedom, and the rule of law.
And just 2 years later, in December of 1992, Bush, Mexican President Carlos Salinas, and Canadian Prime Minister Brian Mulroney officially signed the North Atlantic Free Trade Agreement, otherwise known as NAFTA.
Calling it a defining moment, President Clinton, with great fanfare, signed legislation putting the North American Free Trade Agreement into law.
Then in 1993, President Bill Clinton, he signs on to NAFTA and then executes the agreement, creating the North American Development Bank and the Border Environment Cooperation Commission. Another year later, Miami, the Summit of the Americas, 1994. The U.S., Canada, and Mexico invite Chile and 33 more nations to join, expanding the pact to be called the Free Trade Area of the Americas, or the FTAA. Barriers to trade and investment are eliminated. Flash forward 6 years, the year 2000. While Americans are celebrating their independence, this July 4th would mark a new date in world history. The date Mexican President Vicente Fox proposes his 20 to 30-year timeline for the creation of a common North American market. Meanwhile, Ted Cruz is working for the Bush-Cheney presidential campaign as their domestic policy advisor. Cruz eventually assists Bush in winning the now infamous Florida recount, then accepting a position in the Bush administration Justice Department and Federal Trade Commission. Then the following year, 2001, Dr. Robert Passer publishes his book, Towards a North American Community. In it, he openly calls for the creation of a North American Union. And in doing so, he earns the name, the founding father of the NAU. April 2001, President George W. Bush continues where his father and previous presidents left off and signs the Declaration of Quebec City, renewing the commitment to hemispheric integration. 5 months later, a new Pearl Harbor would plunge the United States into a global war on terror. Three years after 9/11, in November of 2004, the Independent Task Force on the Future of North America is formed. Their focus, no longer trade and prosperity, but security. The sponsoring parties are not politicians acting in an official capacity, but instead three private groups headed by the Council on Foreign Relations and their respective organizations in Canada and Mexico. They claim, in their own words, North America is vulnerable on several fronts. The region faces terrorist and criminal security threats, increased economic competition from abroad, and uneven economic development at home. The CFR taps the wife of Ted Cruz to become a member of the task force. Heidi Cruz accepts. Now, March of 2005 would be a big year for advancing the agenda of the North American Union. And with the CFR laying the groundwork, Mexico, Canada, and the U.S. would sign the Security and Prosperity Partnership, or SPP.
Susan, I want to switch gears, talk about this other issue that's out there, the creation of a new North American Union, if you will, similar to the EU, the European Union. The president was asked about this today at the summit meeting with the leaders of Mexico and Canada. Listen to what he said.
I'm amused by the difference between what actually takes place in the meetings and what some were trying to say takes place. It's quite comical, actually, when you realize the difference between reality and what some people are talking on TV about.
Well, what is the background? What's going on here?
Well, Wolf, there's a lot of talk in the blogosphere and conspiracy theorists who believe that this summit was really a secret plot, if you will, to establish a super government in support of big business, that even there would be some sort of super highway that would be traveling through all three of the countries. That
same month, the Texas Department of Transportation signs the agreement to build the Texas NAFTA superhighway parallel to Interstate 35. And Heidi Cruz's task force publishes their report, Building a North American Community. 3 months later, in June of 2005, Lou Dobbs goes on CNN and blasts Dr. Robert Pastor's congressional testimony on the CFR report to expand the borders and eviscerate U.S. sovereignty by incorporating Canada and Mexico. America begins to take notice.
The Bush administration's open borders policy and its decision to ignore the enforcement of this country's immigration laws is part of a broader agenda. President Bush signed a formal agreement that will end the United States as we know it, and he took the step without approval from either the U.S. Congress or the people of the United States. Bill Tucker reports.
The Security and Prosperity Partnership of North America sounds benign, hardly like a policy that critics call NAFTA on steroids. It's a deal that few have even heard of.
It's being done again by very few people at the very top on behalf of the investment class, but the working class of people, political officials across our country, from communities, from cities and so forth, they don't know anything about this.
Yet it was agreed to by Mexico's President Fox, Canada's Prime Minister Martin, and President Bush in 2005. Administration officials counter their critics by saying everything about SPP is on the White House website. And they say the partnership is not a treaty, but more of an outline of priorities between the United States, Mexico, and Canada. Still, some wonder why there haven't been public discussions about the goals being pursued.
This SPP includes, for instance, a committee that is sitting down to harmonize our meat inspection and food safety. So how far away from a trade agreement can your dining room table and what you feed your kids be?
Other parts of the agreement mention border security as an issue, which include all of North America. In fact, the name of the agreement is not Security and Prosperity of the United States, but of North America.
The Dobbs clip was heralded as a massive public revelation. And then what would appear to be a coordinated effort, Patrick Wood of the August Review, Congressman Ron Paul, and Patrick Buchanan all come out against the proposed merger of the three nations, sparking a national outcry from the grassroots. The liberty movement in America goes into overdrive. Texans push back against the NAFTA superhighway. So what does this mean? Look, it took 42 years to create the European Union. If we continue on this timeline using the European Union template, beginning with Reagan's initiation of the North American Community in 1981, we should see full dissolution of U.S. sovereignty by around 2023, meeting the deadline Vicente Fox announced on July 4th of the year 2000. My friends, they say nothing in politics is a coincidence. That date was picked to send a message. So here we are at the onset of the 2016 election, 7 years from the Fox deadline. Ted Cruz is the first player in the game. So just who is he really? Should we believe his liberty rhetoric? Remember, he is the man who won Bush the Florida recount and then landed a job in the Bush administration. His own wife is a Wall Street insider and one of the architects of the destruction of U.S. sovereignty through her membership in the Council on Foreign Relations. These few points alone make Ted the perfect candidate for selection. And if he is selected to be president in 2016 and then reelected in 2020, that would make Heidi Cruz the first lady of the North American Union by 2023. Sound off in the comments, hit that share button, and tell someone what we're doing over here at the Next News Network. I'm Gary Franchi.
Again, if you didn't catch that, Next News Network, Gary Franchi. Now, if you look at what Obama has been doing with the borders, it kind of feeds all into that, and it kind of feeds into just another puppet show. When you look at the breaking down of the borders and what they're trying to do, which I'm not. I'm a libertarian. I'm not for governmental borders, but that's the thing. They're not breaking down the borders. They're joining our borders. They're breaking down the borders between us to create a bigger state. And that's just centralizing the power more, and we see what that's done to the EU. Really, none of the nations in the EU are faring off too well because they don't have the control over their stuff. And basically, they would have to withdraw from the EU to gain their sovereignty. And, well, what happens when countries try to succeed from... Oh, yeah, it doesn't usually turn out too well. Not saying it can't happen. It just, the majority of the time, it doesn't turn out too well. And one side's usually punished, which you look at something like North Korea, South Korea. Well, North Korea, who's really actually punished? It's the everyday person. Now, I actually see this going through because they're continuing projects to really create this. It's like they're going through with it without doing it, if that makes any sense. They'll create these highway systems that will be easily connected. Things like the NAFTA superhighway, things like this are going to happen, and they'll just do it in different ways. And you see all the steps taking place that are leading to this. And I think this becomes a world issue. And it goes back to we are in, the beginnings of a world war. And when I've said that, we're in the death throes of the empire, I already see them having the order out of chaos planned. Now, I've talked about this before, you know, the order out of chaos theory. The order out of chaos is they already have this plan for the North American Union. They can collapse the U.S. dollar because they will benefit. They don't care about you. Remember this. They don't care about you. If they collapse the U.S. dollar, it'll affect you. It won't affect them because they'll have, you know, the you know, American, what was it? Amero. And they'll fare out. I'm sure they're already creating the currency. I'm sure people already have it. It would not surprise me. And I think this is pretty revealing, and a lot of important information coming out about Ted Cruz that is breaking now that does not fare well for him. Definitely with a lot of the long-term grassroots libertarian people that have really, you know, when I'm saying that, you know, the modern day Tea Party originalists, the people that really started getting involved, really started researching, really started, you know, the way a lot of us got where we are in our ideology is, you know, continuously, you know, taking on issue after issue and questioning our own beliefs. You know, you as a constitutionalist, a lot of people want to argue that we should, you know, have some tax to pay for military for our national defense. And we argue, you know, does our money actually go for national defense or, you know, bombing countries? Should we be forcibly taxed? If we feel there's a threat, would it voluntarily paying for national defense be something most people would be willing to do? Kind of the origination at the constitutional level, you would think that these people are going to see Ted Cruz and this information and go, yeah, it, you know, we've known him not to be a true liberty person. And we pointed out some stuff before. I know I have, at least, about Ted Cruz. And I played the clip where he shunned the audience for not, you know, if you won't stand with Israel or something to that point, you know, I don't stand with you. Or it's this guy, he has an agenda, and he's been playing cards. He's put on a poker face in the name of liberty. And, you know, when I've played clips like that and I've read other articles, and, you know, he's really pointed to being a wolf in sheep's clothing. And I think that most people have been played. Other people have understood and played the game with them for their own beliefs that have nothing to do with your individual liberty here in America. That, you know, that's where they say their focus is. Okay, where are we sitting with time? Oh, we're kind of running out here slowly. Okay, here we go. Maybe. Yeah, here it goes. Now, one thing we've talked about with this relates to the CIA is, we pointed out, the whole Rick Ross out there in California, and it being exposed, CIA behind the drug running. There's been reports that, these small planes owned by CIA have went down with drugs in them. Well, a DOJ report exposes DEA agents, sex parties with prostitutes funded by Colombian drug cartels. Oh, yeah. This out of benswan.com. And this report looks like it comes from Daily Surge. But I'm going to play this clip here.
Within the Drug Enforcement Administration. This just breaking right before the real story started today. New report from a government watchdog alleges DEA agents used money from drug cartels to pay for sex parties with prostitutes at a post overseas. Peter Ducey, live with this report from Washington. What'd you find out, Peter?
Gretchen, we found out that more than once, 10 DEA agents found themselves surrounded by prostitutes at an overseas post, and those prostitutes were paid for by drug cartels. It sounds really bad, and the Inspector General at the Justice Department explains why with this, quote, the inspector said that she explained to OPR management that the fact that most of the sex parties occurred in government-leased quarters where agents' laptops, BlackBerry devices, and other government-issued equipment were present created potential security risks for the DEA and for the agents who participated in the parties, potentially exposing them to extortion, blackmail, or coercion. And now the House Judiciary Committee Chairman Bob Goodlatte says these agents acted like they were in a frat house. And the House Oversight Committee Chairman Jason Chaffetz very bluntly adds this, quote, let there be no mistake, this is a national security threat. While the vast majority of employees do quality work, the bad apples highlighted in their report taint their service. This all went down between 2005 and 2008, and the Inspector General has the DEA on a list, Gretchen, where they say employees aren't told to stay away from prostitutes, even in places where it is legal for the locals.
Ah, okay. Very interesting. Secret Service problems and now in the DEA. Peter Ducey, thank you so much. And time now to check in with Shepard Smith, reporting live from...
And, of course, that was Megyn Kelly, Fox News. Daily Surge embedded on benswan.com. We know that this stuff is happening, and most people are not willing to do anything about it. And it's because I think really there's a cognitive dissonance and too much of a comfort state. But I think that abruptly is going to come to an end. And when Obama talks about distributing wealth, I don't think he's just talking about the United States. And I think it's in his wording, too. He likes to say America most of the time. And then you see the open borders. And when you look at NAFTA and the creation of the North American Union, AMERO, I think you're going to start to quickly see, and I think we already basically have by the moving of our factories to places like Mexico, and them not always turning out so successful. Now most of the wealthy are moving to China. Because China's empire is kind of established, and if they move to Hong Kong or something that they can usually do fairly well. And when you start looking at what's happening here in the creation of more of like a North American Union, and you see what's happened to the Euro and the fighting between Russia and the EU over Ukraine, the trying to create this, seems like they're trying to create an Ottoman Empire, a caliphate over in the Middle East. And I think people like Iran that are being propped up by Russia are trying to fight off, and I'm sure Syria is being backed by Russia to a point, trying to fight off this ISIS, which I've stated I think is more of the army, kind of proxy army of Saudi Arabia, doing the dirty deeds for Saudi Arabia. And I think the attack on Yemen might be because of some threat to Saudi Arabia itself, like this is a warning, don't turn on us. We're allowing you to operate. We're allowing you to create this caliphate, but we will lead it in the end. But if we look at what's going on here in America, we're basically going to look at the distribution of the wealth of Canada and the United States into Mexico and some of South America. And I think this is why Russia has been trying to work feverishly to get some of these South American countries that already kind of side with Russia to sign on to a currency with Russia and China. And guess what? I don't think the EU trusts in America anymore. And I think they're seeing the failing state of the EU, and some of these countries are signing on with Russia and China. And this creation of a bank, which I believe to be the next, central petrodollar in a currency that these countries come up with. And this will be your first glimpse at a world currency, centralized world currency. Like I've said before, Bitcoin I believe to be more of a decentralized world currency, a transactional way of trading wealth with someone else for services or goods, as long as it's accepted other places. And in the end, you can transact it into something so that even the end user that ends up with that Bitcoin can transact it into something. I'm not a sole believer in electronic currency. I think it's only a backup. I prefer gold and silver for, something to have around. If you have a little bit of gold, a little bit of silver, a little bit of Bitcoin, a little bit of seeds, the list goes on. Just, a little bit of water supply, you can be prepared. And in this uncertain world, thank you all for tuning in.
Ozzy Skateboard, and you're listening to UC